Hey guys, tonight we step into a quiet village as the sun dips below the horizon, the sky bruised purple and gold, and the air already carrying a faint, sour tang of unwashed livestock and smoke. You trudge past thatched roofs glimmering with evening dew, and for a moment, life feels ordinary, almost sleepy. But listen closely, the crows aren't just settling down for the night. They seem to murmur warnings you can't quite understand. You probably won't survive this unscathed, and that thought creeps along the back of your neck like a chill. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, leave a quick note of where you're watching from and what the local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander down a narrow lane, stones slick with last night's rain. Smoke curls from chimneys in haphazard plumes, carrying the familiar smells of bread baking and animals settling in for the night. A dog barks somewhere, a sound sharper than expected, and you feel a flicker of tension. Life is still moving, yet poised on the edge. Families have started whispering about a sickness, though no one yet dares say it aloud. Your neighbor's wife coughs behind closed shutters, and you notice the pattern forming, the way rumors travel faster than people. Historians still argue whether early warning systems in these villages actually saved lives, or merely spread panic. Inside your small home, the hearth crackles. You poke at the fire, noting the comforting glow against the gloom outside. The children play quietly, unaware of the looming shadow, while you listen for sounds that don't belong. Perhaps a distant scream, perhaps nothing at all. The local priest moves from door to door, sprinkling holy water, muttering prayers, and shaking his head at those who hoard salt or trade goods secretly. Some swear these rituals can shield you from the invisible threat. Fringe accounts tell of villagers who rubbed crushed spider webs on their skin, convinced it would trap the illness, though you're skeptical, and rightly so. Families begin to inventory their supplies. Flour is precious, water barrels are scrubbed, and jars of preserved meat are counted with a nervous reverence. Every small act of preparation carries weight, as if touching the past and future simultaneously. You sit quietly, noticing how ordinary objects, a ladle, a wool blanket, a chipped mug, suddenly become symbols of endurance. Smoke from cooking fires mingles with the evening mist, and your stomach tightens, partly from hunger, partly from a strange, anticipatory dread. As night deepens, you step outside to watch the stars flicker weakly through clouds. The silence is thick, broken only by the occasional owl or creak of timber. Families huddle together, sharing whispers about neighbors who are already sick, and about those who have vanished without a trace. You feel a primal urge to cling to someone, anyone, even as you know that closeness carries risk. Somehow, despite the unease, there's warmth here too. The faint comfort of shared routine, laughter over a small joke, the brushing of hands while passing bread. Even on the cusp of catastrophe, human connection lingers stubbornly. You trace your fingers over the wooden table, worn smooth by years of meals and arguments, imagining the countless faces that have touched it before you. Someone in the village swears they saw rats acting strangely, running in unusual patterns through the fields, an omen perhaps, or just coincidence. Historians still debate whether the plague's early spread was more due to fleas, rats, or the movement of desperate travelers. Your mind oscillates between disbelief and caution. By the flickering candlelight, you consider the notion that survival might be less about divine favor and more about attentiveness, adaptability, and a bit of luck. Outside, the wind rustles through the trees, carrying the first hints of a chill that will become relentless. Your heart beats a little faster. You recall that everyone you know, neighbors, friends, distant cousins, is potentially vulnerable, and the village's fragile social web begins to show its first threads of strain. Whispered rumors mingle with practical plans. Keep the doors closed, someone advises. Do not touch the sick. Others insist on prayer or charms. Families begin to divide chores differently. Some focus on cleaning, some on foraging, some on watching the children. Each choice feels monumental, as if deciding who survives and who does not might rest in those small daily acts. By the time you lay down, the moon casts silver streaks across the rooftops. You imagine that even the cats have sensed the change, padding silently along walls. Sleep is fitful, as your mind replays conversations, catches of laughter, and the faint coughs you heard outside. Yet there's an undercurrent of resolve. Families, even unknowingly, are rehearsing the gestures, routines, and protective measures that might let them endure. They are already adapting in small ways, dividing tasks, watching for early signs of illness, sharing warmth and food, even whispering strange remedies. Tomorrow will be different. You can sense it. But tonight, for now, you feel the delicate tension of a world poised between ordinary life and the first tremors of catastrophe. In these quiet moments, you glimpse what survival will demand. Not just caution, but attention, creativity, and the stubborn maintenance of human connection against encroaching fear. The village, though unaware, is at the threshold of history, and you are right there with it, standing on the precipice, sensing the storm before it breaks. The next morning, the village seems almost unchanged, and yet you feel the subtle shift in the air. You step into the cobbled street, boots clicking against damp stones, and notice neighbors exchanging glances heavier than usual. Rumors of fevered bodies begin to drift through the marketplace, whispered over the scent of fresh bread and the tang of morning dew. Mothers tug children closer. Fathers wipe their hands on aprons as if cleanliness alone could ward off the invisible enemy. You feel that tense, unspoken question in every glance. Is this the sickness everyone fears, or merely a bad cold? Historians still argue whether early village warning systems were effective or merely heightened paranoia. But either way, anxiety spreads faster than the illness. Inside your home, the family gathers around the table, breadcrumbs falling unnoticed onto the rough wood. Someone coughs, and heads snap up, eyes darting toward the corner where the child had been playing yesterday. The conversation is cautious, filled with coded phrases meant to report illness without inviting fear. Old Giles looks pale, someone whispers. I saw smoke rising from his chimney. You sense the tension in your own chest, a rhythm that mimics the nervous energy of the room. Fringe reports claim that some families carried dried toads or crushed gemstones in pockets, convinced they could repel disease. You might chuckle, if you weren't already holding your breath. The marketplace, once bustling, feels smaller and tighter today. Stallholders arrange wares with exaggerated care, avoiding unnecessary contact. You notice the grocer counting barley with extra scrutiny and a farmer hesitating to hand over eggs, wiping them with a cloth first. Families barter carefully, wary of strangers, but occasionally offering a loaf of bread to those too weak to negotiate. It's a delicate dance, generosity and suspicion entwined, a social ritual dictated by fear and necessity. Historians still argue whether the mingling of cautious trust and selfishness significantly altered village survival rates. You wander past the church, noting that even the faithful seem hesitant. Candles flicker weakly in drafty windows, and the priest murmurs prayers that almost feel like whispers to himself. Some villagers cling tightly to holy relics or charms, tiny bones, engraved crosses, amulets filled with herbs, while others roll their eyes discreetly, silently questioning whether devotion alone will suffice. Fear and faith blend into a peculiar concoction, shaping behavior and interactions. Your family debates whether to participate, arguing quietly over the efficacy of rituals versus practical caution. Inside, you check the larder, dried fruits, salted meats, and jars of preserved milk. You notice how households begin rationing not out of necessity yet, but in anticipation, calculating meals, plotting which foods last, and who eats what. The act of dividing food becomes an exercise in mindfulness, almost meditative, yet tinged with dread. You even notice how certain spices, once used for flavor alone, are now considered protective against disease, a blend of superstition and practical knowledge. The children are restless. You watch them play tag in the street, their laughter ringing oddly hollow against the tense backdrop of whispered warnings. Parents redirect them indoors frequently, citing chores or lessons, but you can tell that curiosity and naivety drive them into corners of the village adults are wary to enter. Some children carry charms or trinkets believed to shield them, another layer of precaution that skirts the edge of folklore. Fringe accounts suggest that a few children were trained to spot early signs of illness, tiny noses, sudden fatigue, pallor, but whether this genuinely aided survival remains uncertain. Neighbors pass cautiously, sometimes tipping hats, sometimes avoiding eye contact. Families start to note patterns in symptoms: sudden chills, swollen lymph nodes, persistent coughs. Conversations evolve into whispered inventories of who might be infected, which strains caution with fear. You catch snippets of advice: keep to sunlight if you can, someone murmurs, and avoid damp floors. Some swear that bathing in vinegar or rubbing onions under your arms can help. You roll your eyes, yet inwardly wonder if these rituals might have eased anxiety, even if they didn't stop the disease. As the sun rises higher, smoke spirals from distant chimneys, and you notice a neighbor hauling water from the well for an ailing relative. Simple gestures, fetching water, preparing porridge, cleaning bedding, become heroic acts that will define survival long before the plague's actual toll is fully realized. The village feels like a theater of quiet vigilance, each family performing in parallel yet connected by shared threat. Historians still debate how much of early survival depended on practical care versus sheer luck, but the gestures themselves, mundane yet intimate, lay the foundation for collective endurance. By mid-afternoon, you find yourself observing patterns in human behavior. Fear triggers routines: washing hands obsessively, tying children's aprons tighter, covering faces with cloth. Families discuss strategies in hushed tones, negotiating small compromises between ritual and reason. The tension between superstition and practicality shapes every decision, coloring ordinary life with urgency. You notice subtle acts of empathy, like sharing bread with a coughing neighbor or whispering instructions to someone too weak to move. In these acts, you see the resilience of human bonds. As evening descends, shadows lengthen across streets now quieted by caution. The once familiar village has begun its transformation. Eyes are sharper, gestures slower, voices lower. Families consolidate, pulling together small havens of warmth, creating spaces both protective and comforting. You notice how interiors, hearths, tables, beds, become fortresses of daily survival, microcosms of the broader struggle. Even at this early stage, the village hums with vigilance, empathy, and quiet preparation, a delicate balance of fear and resilience that will define the days to come. The next morning, the rhythm of the village feels subtly altered. You trudge down streets that are still familiar yet feel smaller, tighter, more cautious. Doors remain shut longer, and windows are slightly cracked, as if to peer at the world without inviting it in. Families begin treating their homes less like simple shelters and more like fortresses, layering doors with extra wooden planks, moving furniture to create temporary barriers. You notice that even small spaces, the pantry, the attic, the corner of a room where the children sleep, take on new significance. They are repurposed into isolation zones for those showing the first hints of fever, a silent choreography of care and containment. Historians still argue whether such domestic quarantines meaningfully reduced transmission, but in practice, they give villagers a sense of control. Inside, the family gathers to strategize daily life. You notice discussions about which rooms are safest, how to ventilate without inviting drafts, and which corners of the house are best for preserving warmth. The hearth becomes both a practical and psychological anchor, the center around which all activity rotates. Sometimes it smells of roasting meat, sometimes just of burning kindling, but always it carries the reassurance of routine. Fringe reports suggest that some households even lined floors with sand or ashes, believing it absorbed disease like a sponge, an odd, harmless superstition that still demonstrates human ingenuity. Meals are prepared with an almost ceremonial precision. You watch someone scrub vegetables with vinegar, patting them dry before slicing, while another counts each loaf of bread, rationing portions carefully. This is more than frugality, it is ritualized preparation, an attempt to assert order in a world that seems increasingly unpredictable. Children are instructed on chores that now carry grave importance: fetching water, sweeping floors, or tending small garden plots where herbs are grown for both nutrition and supposed medicinal benefit. Some herbs, like rue or sage, were believed to cleanse the air, though historians still argue whether such practices had any real effect, or merely eased anxiety. Visitors are scarce. Even familiar neighbors linger at thresholds, offering advice or small gifts without crossing the line into intimacy. You notice the tension in these interactions, the dance of politeness under the shadow of suspicion. Families begin keeping journals or lists: who went where, who coughed, what remedies were tried. These records are crude but invaluable, a rudimentary tracking of illness before anyone could formalize such systems. Fringe accounts claim some villagers even used chalk to mark doors of the sick, a practice that may have informed later quarantine protocols. Inside the home, improvisation is constant. You trudge past stacks of blankets used as makeshift barriers, or see pots of boiling water set in corners to steam the air. Windows are opened or closed depending on wind direction, and even children are enlisted to monitor temperature, delivering messages about new symptoms. Small rituals emerge: washing hands before and after contact, separating personal utensils, or assigning a single caregiver per sick person. Each act is mundane in isolation, but together they form a lattice of protective behaviors that quietly bolster survival. Neighbors' stories reach you in fragments. Someone claims their cat avoided the sick room entirely, which they interpret as a warning from nature itself. Others insist on keeping candles burning to drive out the pestilence. You might smile at these measures, but you recognize their psychological weight. Each charm or precaution eases the gnawing tension, giving people a sense of agency. Historians still argue whether psychological comfort indirectly affected physical survival rates, but there is little doubt it shaped daily life. As the day stretches on, you see families balance practical survival with small pleasures. Children sneak fruit from hidden jars, adults share brief laughter over clumsy cooking attempts, and pets weave through the home as both companions and wardens of routine. You notice how these simple patterns, meal preparation, cleaning, tending fires, become crucial anchors, helping to maintain mental stability when the world outside grows increasingly uncertain. Evenings are quiet, with shadows deepening and sounds muted. You watch your own household settle into a cautious rhythm, closing doors, stacking blankets, checking on the weakest members. Conversations soften, and you notice a shared vigilance that binds the family in ways ordinary days never demanded. Homes have transformed into protective microcosms, their layout, chores, and rituals carefully designed to keep sickness at bay while nurturing the fragile pulse of life inside. By nightfall, the fortification of homes is complete, at least for the moment. You trace the paths of care, isolation, and precaution that each family has drawn, noticing how even small innovations, like hanging wet cloths to filter air or creating simple sign systems for communication, represent ingenious adaptations to unprecedented circumstances. In these hours, survival is less about heroics and more about discipline, observation, and quiet creativity. You recognize the subtle yet profound shift. Everyday spaces are now arenas of endurance, and every small act, no matter how mundane, becomes a lifeline. By the next morning, the village buzzes with a tense, muted energy. You trudge toward the larder, noting how food, once merely sustenance, has become a strategic resource, a lifeline in an unpredictable world. Families measure every morsel, rationing bread and grain with painstaking care, counting eggs and dried meats, storing root vegetables in cellars that are cooler and more secure than before. You overhear whispers about bartering. "I'll trade a chicken for a jug of milk," someone murmurs. Markets are no longer casual gatherings but carefully calculated exchanges where trust and caution collide. Historians still argue whether tight local economies helped villagers survive longer or simply redistributed risk unevenly, but the stakes feel real and immediate. Inside your home, meals are prepared like small rituals. Water is boiled for safety, soups simmer for hours to stretch ingredients, and leftovers are carefully divided for later use. You notice the subtle shift in cooking methods. Spices, once decorative, are now functional, used to mask taste, prevent spoilage, or perhaps offer a psychological shield against disease. Fringe accounts suggest that some households even used crushed garlic or powdered herbs as airborne deterrents, a peculiar blend of superstition and practicality. The children, meanwhile, are enlisted as assistants in rationing, counting beans, fetching small portions, and even reminding adults to avoid contamination. Famine is never far from thought. Fields that once produced abundance now bear signs of neglect as labor dwindles. Villagers hesitate to travel far for fear of contagion. Families debate which crops to prioritize, which livestock to keep, and which animals to cull or sell. Some stash preserved grains, while others hoard fresh vegetables, creating internal conflicts between immediate need and future security. You notice tension in conversations. Every decision about food carries moral and practical weight, a constant balancing act between survival and sharing. Historians still debate whether such rationing strategies effectively prevented malnutrition during the plague, or if fear alone dictated most choices. You trudge along familiar streets, noticing subtle signs of adaptation. Neighbors leave small bundles of bread outside doors for those too weak to fetch supplies themselves, a quiet act of generosity that is often anonymous. Families create informal rotation systems for foraging and shopping, alternating who ventures out, limiting exposure, and sharing observations. You catch the meticulous care in every act, wiping coins, covering baskets, avoiding crowds. These small decisions ripple through the community, creating a fragile network of sustenance that is as social as it is practical. In homes, children learn the practicalities of scarcity. You see them instructed in stretching simple ingredients, boiling water before use, or preserving fruits and vegetables with minimal spoilage. Games evolve too. Tag is replaced by cautious scavenger hunts or indoor contests, teaching resourcefulness while limiting unnecessary exposure. Every lesson, however playful, carries a survival undercurrent. Fringe accounts describe children inventing small coded signals for who is ill, a rudimentary form of epidemic intelligence. Whether effective or not, it underscores the pervasive awareness that even the youngest members are participants in a household's endurance. You notice also the psychological layers of rationing. Food is a comfort as much as it is a tool, and preparing meals together reinforces bonds even amid stress. Families share stories while chopping vegetables, laugh over mishaps in cooking, and trade small morsels for amusement or reward. The act of preparing food becomes meditative, a way to assert control over an uncontrollable environment. Historians still argue whether this communal engagement tangibly improved survival, but the cohesion it fosters is undeniable. Bartering outside the home becomes a careful negotiation. You observe how trust is weighed with every transaction. A loaf of bread might require a nod of recognition, a brief inspection of coins, or the hand-washing ritual observed at each doorstep. Some families accept strangers' offers reluctantly, others insist on trading only within known networks. Despite fear, acts of generosity appear in subtle forms: a loaf left for a neighbor, a basket of herbs offered without expectation of return. Even amid scarcity, humanity finds channels to persist. By midday, households have adopted a rhythm that balances caution with necessity. Children, adults, and elders each have roles in the careful orchestration of meals and supply management. You notice subtle innovations: storing food in multiple locations to minimize contamination, keeping detailed inventories, and using visual cues like chalk marks to track what has been consumed. These micro-strategies reflect ingenuity and foresight, blending superstition, observation, and practicality. Evening brings reflection. You sit near the hearth, counting the day's successes: meals preserved, exchanges completed, children safely guided. The act of food preparation and rationing has become a quiet ritual of reassurance, anchoring the family against the chaos outside. In these moments, you understand how something as ordinary as bread can become a symbol of survival, trust, and resilience. Each bite carries not only nutrition but also the accumulated strategies of the household, small victories in a prolonged contest against scarcity. Night falls, and the village is cloaked in shadow. You notice chimneys with smoke, doors firmly closed, and children sleeping more restively than in the preceding nights. Homes now function as both sanctuaries and strategic nodes in the broader network of survival. Even the smallest acts, stirring a pot, rationing sugar, fetching water, reflect a delicate balance between prudence and hope. As you lie down, you sense that families are learning, evolving, and adapting, that the interplay of scarcity, foresight, and quiet creativity may just be enough to carry them through the days ahead. The following day begins with a sense of cautious experimentation. You trudge to the hearth, watching the steam rise from a pot of herbal tea, an attempt to soothe throats and perhaps deter illness. Remedies abound, some grounded in practical experience, others in superstition. Boiled herbs, vinegar compresses, and poultices are applied with care, while you overhear heated debates about whether certain treatments truly help. Historians still argue whether medieval households' use of herbs and rudimentary hygiene slowed infection rates, or if survival hinged primarily on isolation and chance. You notice your own skepticism, yet you can't help but feel a flicker of hope at each small ritual. Inside the home, the family divides responsibilities with increasing precision. One adult prepares medicinal infusions, another monitors children for signs of fever, and a third cleans the most used surfaces. The children, now more aware of risk, help fetch fresh herbs or water, learning practical knowledge through participation. Fringe accounts tell of families burning aromatic woods to cleanse the air, a practice with negligible scientific effect but immense psychological value. You watch as routines solidify, creating a quiet rhythm that balances anxiety with tangible action. Outside, neighbors exchange information with guarded caution. One woman whispers about a distant cousin's sudden illness. A man nods knowingly, warning about herbs that supposedly repel plague-carrying fleas. Markets operate in hushed tones, with families carefully exchanging goods while avoiding unnecessary contact. You notice a tension between fear and necessity. Generosity is tempered by caution, and curiosity is often masked behind polite gestures. Acts of help, offering bread, advising on remedies, coexist with suspicion, producing a complex social dance that reinforces both connection and boundaries. The practice of isolation evolves subtly. You see small rooms cordoned with blankets, doors marked to indicate the presence of the ill, and daily routines adapted to limit exposure. The household functions as a microcosm of public health. Caregivers use clean cloths, wash hands frequently, and monitor every interaction. Children adapt too, learning to respect boundaries even within their own home, a lesson framed less as punishment and more as survival training. Historians still debate whether these ad hoc measures significantly reduce transmission, yet they remain central to the story of domestic endurance. Meals take on new symbolic weight. You notice that preparing food involves not just sustenance but also careful ritual. Herbs are added with care, water boiled for safety, and portions distributed evenly to conserve resources. Even mistakes become opportunities for learning. Burned bread or over-salted soup prompts quiet reflection and adjustment. Fringe reports suggest some households ingested small amounts of crushed minerals or spices to strengthen the body, demonstrating a blend of experimental curiosity and superstition. These practices, whether effective or not, reinforce a sense of agency amid uncertainty. Children adapt in remarkable ways. You observe them improvising games that maintain engagement while reducing unnecessary movement outside. Some invent coded signals to report symptoms discreetly. Others act as small assistants, carrying herbs, fetching water, or cleaning surfaces. Their participation transforms routine into survival education, embedding vigilance in everyday actions. You note that learning through action, rather than mere instruction, becomes an unspoken strategy for household resilience. Conversations around faith persist. You hear the priest's voice faintly from the square, offering prayers that families observe more cautiously than before. Some combine ritual with practical measures, crossing themselves before washing hands or blessing herbs before administration. Others maintain skepticism, relying solely on observation and experimentation. This interplay of faith and pragmatism underscores the diverse strategies households employ, a testament to adaptability in crisis. Evening approaches, and you trace the day's accomplishments quietly. Herbs are dried, water drawn and boiled, surfaces wiped clean, and the family gathers for a modest meal. Each act, however small, contributes to a sense of control and reassurance. You reflect on the ingenuity required to merge superstition, practical care, and attentive observation into a coherent daily routine. Families may lack formal medical knowledge, yet their adaptive strategies form an intricate, living system of defense against a menace that is otherwise invisible. As night falls, shadows deepen across walls and streets. You notice the subtle shifts in energy, children sleeping more restively, adults exhaling in brief moments of relief, and a faint sense of accomplishment settling over the household. Even amid uncertainty, these small rituals, herbal remedies, isolation measures, careful cleaning, create continuity, a thread of survival that will strengthen in the days to come. You sense that knowledge, observation, and routine are as vital to enduring the plague as any external intervention. By bedtime, the home is both sanctuary and laboratory. You trace each decision, each precaution, and feel the weight of responsibility and hope intertwined. The day's small victories, meals prepared, herbs administered, chores completed, form a lattice of survival strategies, quietly holding the family together while the village outside braces for the unfolding storm. In these moments, you glimpse the essential truth. Survival often rests not on grand heroics, but on the patient, repetitive acts of care and attention that turn a fragile household into a bastion of endurance. That evening, the village feels both familiar and strangely altered. You trudge past the church, noting the quiet intensity of families huddled near hearths, candles flickering, and whispered prayers mixing with the scent of burning wood. Faith takes on a renewed, almost urgent significance. Families cling to church rituals, saintly relics, and charms in the hopes of protection, though privately, you notice some members roll their eyes or mutter doubts. Fear and devotion interlace, shaping daily choices in ways subtle and profound. Historians still argue whether spiritual practice genuinely influenced survival or primarily provided psychological comfort. But either way, it steers human behavior. Inside your home, rituals punctuate routine. You notice a mother crossing herself before handing soup to a child, or a father silently murmuring a prayer over stored grain. Fringe accounts describe families placing a small crucifix near the sickbed or sprinkling holy water around the hearth, convinced it could ward off infection. Some villagers even consulted astrology, calculating days when the stars were supposedly less favorable to disease. Whether effective or not, these practices create structure, grounding households amid unpredictable danger. Children adapt to this spiritual layering in creative ways. They recite brief prayers before chores, imitate adults' careful gestures, or create miniature, sacred corners with pebbles and scraps of cloth. While playful, these acts mirror serious adult strategies, teaching vigilance, rhythm, and patience. You notice that the combination of care and ritual fosters a subtle emotional resilience. Even in fear, life continues through repetition, observation, and small acts of devotion. Neighbors respond in diverse ways. Some gather at church cautiously, maintaining distance, while others avoid public spaces entirely, relying instead on private prayer. Families quietly exchange advice. Which saints' relics are believed strongest, which charms keep rats away, and which prayers should accompany water or food. You notice that fear drives both innovation and imitation, creating an informal network of beliefs and practices that spreads faster than the plague itself. Historians still debate whether this social reinforcement bolstered community cohesion or merely amplified anxiety. Even domestic spaces transform under this dual influence of fear and faith. You see altars created on shelves, prayer books positioned near windows, and herbs arranged in deliberate patterns around doors. Every object gains symbolic weight. Fringe reports describe families chanting softly while cleaning or cooking, believing that intention could imbue tasks with protective power. These small rituals become intertwined with practical survival measures, washing hands, tending fires, preparing meals, blurring the line between superstition and functionality. The psychology of shared fear becomes evident in family interactions. You watch a father offer bread with a whisper of reassurance, a mother guiding a child through a prayer before washing hands, and children mimicking adults with careful concentration. The household functions as a microcosm of social negotiation, blending practical strategies with symbolic gestures. Even minor disputes over chores or resources are tempered by the awareness of vulnerability. Families learn to temper impatience with caution. Meals themselves are infused with ritual. You notice herbs blessed before chopping, water sprinkled lightly with holy symbols, and food portions divvied after a moment of collective contemplation. Children participate, learning that care, attention, and repetition matter as much as ingredients or technique. These subtle actions form a rhythm that nurtures both body and spirit, providing continuity when external circumstances feel chaotic. Historians still argue whether the interplay of superstition and observation materially impacted survival, yet it undeniably shapes daily routines and emotional stability. Outside, you notice subtle acts of faith and generosity among neighbors. A loaf left at a threshold may carry a whispered blessing. A basket of herbs passed through a window might accompany advice about symptom care. Social interactions become coded, blending practical guidance with spiritual reinforcement. You realize that survival is not solely a matter of vigilance but also of trust, empathy, and shared ritualized behavior. As night falls, shadows deepen across streets and rooftops. You notice families quietly assembling for prayers or meditation, children imitating adults' careful gestures, and small acts of devotion reinforcing the protective measures taken throughout the day. Even in darkness, life continues in measured rhythms, tending fires, cleaning surfaces, checking on the ill, and performing symbolic acts intended to keep danger at bay. By bedtime, the interplay of faith, superstition, and observation has created a delicate scaffold that upholds the household. You feel the weight of this dual strategy, practical and spiritual, sustaining both body and mind. Through attentive care, cautious ritual, and shared belief, families carve out spaces of resilience, turning homes into protective enclaves where endurance is possible even as the plague looms outside. In this careful balance, you glimpse the profound human capacity to weave hope, ritual, and reason into a life that refuses to succumb entirely to fear. The following morning, you notice a softer light spilling over the rooftops, yet it barely penetrates the heavy atmosphere that has settled over the village. Children, once free to roam, now skirt the streets with quiet awareness, observing empty doorways and the occasional shadow flitting past. You watch them navigate a world that feels both familiar and perilously altered, learning quickly that absence can be as telling as presence. Whispered instructions from parents, stay close, avoid strangers, notice changes, become lessons in survival embedded within daily routines. Historians still argue whether early childhood experiences during the plague had long-term psychological effects or simply honed practical instincts. Inside homes, children assume surprisingly responsible roles. You see them assisting in meal preparation, fetching water from nearby wells, and even monitoring younger siblings' health. They learn to identify subtle signs, a flushed cheek, a sudden shiver, a lingering cough. Fringe accounts suggest that some children were trained to watch for patterns, who visited whom, when symptoms first appeared, a rudimentary early warning system that helped households adapt. Though these observations may seem minor, they contribute to the broader survival strategy, reinforcing the idea that no household member is too small to participate in resilience. Education itself transforms under these circumstances. You notice parents teaching not just reading and arithmetic but practical knowledge, how to boil water, dry herbs, and ration food efficiently. Lessons occur in whispered tones or at quiet intervals between chores, blending instruction with constant vigilance. Playtime adapts as well. Indoor games simulate real-world tasks, such as delivering messages without touching doors or timing how long boiled herbs should steep. In subtle ways, the plague reshapes childhood, instilling self-sufficiency and attentiveness. Trust and fear intermingle in the wider community. Children learn early whom to approach and whom to avoid. Even familiar neighbors are treated with caution, gestures muted, distance maintained. At the same time, acts of kindness, sharing a loaf of bread, leaving water at a doorstep, or guiding a sick friend to the family's hearth, provide crucial emotional lessons. You notice that these interactions, though constrained, nurture empathy, adaptability, and social intelligence. Historians still debate whether such social adjustments meaningfully impacted survival or were merely coping mechanisms. Within households, routines stabilize into a careful balance of vigilance and comfort. Children are taught small rituals to maintain health: washing hands before meals, avoiding contaminated objects, and signaling if someone feels unwell. These rituals, often repetitive and mundane, quietly reinforce the psychological and practical frameworks needed for survival. Fringe accounts suggest children sometimes acted as informal watchers, relaying signs of illness between rooms, an improvised system of communication that underscores both creativity and necessity. The emotional landscape is equally significant. Children witness their parents' anxiety, yet also observe acts of courage, resourcefulness, and quiet humor. You notice small gestures, a shared joke over a spilled pot, a whispered compliment after a task well done, that punctuate the tension and remind everyone that life, though precarious, persists. Humor becomes a subtle survival tool, easing fear while fostering cohesion. Outdoor exploration is tightly controlled. Children are often confined to yards or courtyards, permitted only brief excursions under supervision. You observe inventive games, collecting herbs, mimicking adult chores, or racing along carefully mapped paths. These activities blend necessity with engagement, teaching observational skills, patience, and attentiveness. Even in play, survival lessons are embedded, turning ordinary moments into vital exercises in awareness. By afternoon, children have become integral to household strategies. They assist in rationing, perform minor cleaning tasks, and help administer simple remedies. Their contributions, often underestimated by outsiders, bolster the household's capacity to respond to the shifting threat. You notice that, through these experiences, they develop resilience, awareness, and a subtle understanding of both human behavior and disease dynamics, skills that will remain long after the crisis passes. Evening approaches, bringing shadows across rooms and streets. Families gather quietly, combining vigilance with domestic rituals. Meals are prepared, herbs arranged, prayers recited, and children guided to participate. The home functions as a microcosm of survival, where observation, cooperation, and learned responsibility coalesce. You notice a sense of continuity. Despite fear, routines anchor daily life, and children learn that vigilance, care, and quiet adaptability are essential to enduring the unseen threat outside. By nightfall, you reflect on the transformation of childhood itself. The plague has imposed lessons in awareness, empathy, and responsibility, shaping a generation that must navigate absence, illness, and uncertainty with a mixture of caution and ingenuity. In these quiet, formative hours, you glimpse how families cultivate resilience in their youngest members, blending instruction, supervision, and subtle play into a coherent strategy for survival. Even in darkness, these children are learning the patterns of endurance that will guide households through the storm. By mid-morning, the village has taken on an eerie rhythm. You trudge down the narrow lanes, observing neighbors through half-open shutters, wary of both proximity and rumor. Trust has become a precious commodity. Families monitor who comes and goes, exchanging cautious greetings or leaving offerings at doorsteps without stepping too close. Acts of generosity persist, but they are laced with calculation, a delicate balance between care and self-preservation. Historians still argue whether these evolving social norms ultimately strengthened communities or merely isolated households further, but either way, the dynamics are undeniable. Inside your home, communication between families adapts. You watch adults passing notes through windows or leaving parcels at thresholds, sometimes with instructions: boil the water before use, or keep the youngest away from the elder. Children imitate these practices, delivering small items with care, reinforcing the household's internal cohesion while minimizing exposure. Fringe accounts even mention coded knocks or signals to convey health updates, an improvised epidemic intelligence that blends practicality with ingenuity. Neighborhood interactions are often punctuated by cautious observation. You notice subtle gestures, an approving nod, a brief exchange of supplies, or the avoidance of eye contact, that communicate both information and intent. Families weigh risk constantly: who can be trusted, who might carry illness, and which actions could imperil the household. These small social calibrations shape daily life as much as any tangible precaution. Within the home, chores and responsibilities are increasingly specialized. One adult handles meal preparation, another oversees hygiene, and children are assigned observation tasks. You notice the meticulous attention given to cleanliness. Floors swept repeatedly, benches wiped with vinegar, cooking implements sterilized in boiling water. Even minor lapses provoke discussion and adjustment, emphasizing how the household evolves through trial, error, and constant vigilance. Historians still debate whether such domestic routines materially slowed the plague spread, yet they undeniably reflect adaptive human behavior. The emotional tension is palpable. Families experience fear and fatigue, yet moments of solidarity emerge in response to necessity. You notice a neighbor discreetly sharing surplus bread, or a mother teaching her children songs that reinforce hygiene practices. Humor and reassurance appear subtly, easing anxiety while reinforcing cooperation. These behaviors, seemingly minor, strengthen social bonds and help households endure the psychological weight of prolonged uncertainty. Children, in particular, develop nuanced social skills. You see them learning whom to trust, how to deliver messages safely, and when to retreat from potentially dangerous situations. Play becomes intertwined with vigilance. Scavenger hunts transform into observation exercises, and indoor games simulate the precautions needed in the wider world. Through these activities, children internalize patterns of caution and adaptability, skills crucial for survival. Neighborhood strategies also evolve. Families coordinate movements to avoid overlap, stagger visits to water sources, and share warnings discreetly. You notice an unspoken network emerging, built on observation, shared knowledge, and cautious generosity. Fringe accounts suggest some households even practiced small-scale quarantines for visitors, marking doors or setting aside separate seating areas, reflecting an intuitive grasp of infection control that blends practicality with ritual. By afternoon, the village is a delicate lattice of connected yet distanced households. Trust, suspicion, and cooperation intersect constantly, shaping both interaction and survival strategies. You observe families reinforcing boundaries, monitoring symptoms, and exchanging advice, all while maintaining routines that anchor daily life. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these early social adaptations, but they undoubtedly influenced household behavior. Evening brings a quiet pause. Shadows lengthen across walls and streets, and families consolidate, drawing inward to hearths, altars, and workspaces. You notice children participating in prayers, chores, and quiet observation, internalizing lessons in vigilance and empathy. The interplay of caution, care, and subtle social negotiation forms a protective rhythm that will guide households through coming days. By nightfall, you recognize the subtle power of neighborhood dynamics. Despite fear and scarcity, acts of cautious trust, selective generosity, and vigilant observation create a fragile network of support. Families are learning to navigate social life in a transformed world, balancing self-preservation with mutual aid. These quiet adaptations, small gestures intertwined with daily routines, form a social scaffolding that sustains both emotional and practical endurance in the midst of crisis. By mid-morning, the village feels oddly ordered, despite the undercurrent of fear. You trudge along streets now partially cordoned with ropes or markers, evidence of early quarantine efforts. Officials, or sometimes self-appointed village elders, enforce curfews, limit gatherings, and designate spaces where the sick may be tended without risking the healthy. You notice the tension in every interaction. A brief nod or a hurried step aside communicates compliance and caution simultaneously. Historians still argue whether these ad hoc quarantines genuinely slowed plague spread or merely offered the illusion of control, but the rules undeniably shaped daily behavior. Inside homes, families adapt to the restrictions. Children are encouraged to stay within designated rooms or courtyards, while adults rotate chores to minimize unnecessary contact. You watch careful hand-washing routines, boiling of utensils, and meticulous cleaning of shared surfaces. Fringe accounts suggest that some households even marked doors with chalk symbols to signal illness or contamination, a practice that might have informed later municipal health policies. These precautions, practical or symbolic, create a rhythm of life centered on minimizing exposure. Markets and communal spaces operate under new constraints. You notice the grocer placing coins in a small wooden tray instead of direct hand-to-hand exchange, farmers leaving produce on benches for pickup without interaction, and neighbors following strict spacing during brief conversations. Even informal gatherings are choreographed carefully, with staggered arrivals and whispered instructions. The interplay of fear, necessity, and adaptation turns everyday commerce into a delicate negotiation, a dance that is as much social as it is practical. Families refine internal rules. You observe adults coordinating tasks to reduce overlap. One handles cooking, another fetches water, while a third monitors children or the sick. These rotations prevent exhaustion, limit exposure, and maintain a semblance of order in an otherwise chaotic environment. Children internalize these rhythms, learning the value of patience, attentiveness, and subtle communication. Fringe accounts claim that some households used small bells or signals to convey information without entering rooms, a rudimentary method of contact tracing in action. The emotional landscape is complicated. Families experience relief at adherence to curfews, frustration at restrictions, and worry about neighbors who fail to comply. You notice subtle negotiations, a father pleading with a son to limit playtime outdoors, a mother urging careful sharing of herbs, children reminding each other of rules in playful yet earnest tones. These interactions, small and routine, reinforce vigilance and provide psychological scaffolding, making the invisible threat feel more manageable. Trust and compliance extend beyond individual households. You watch neighbors leave parcels at doorsteps, sometimes with notes indicating careful disinfection or instructions for handling. Acts of generosity exist alongside strict boundaries, creating a delicate network of mutual aid that mitigates both social isolation and the spread of disease. Historians still debate how effective these networks were in improving survival rates, but their social function is clear. You notice the adaptation of traditional rituals to new constraints. Prayers, blessings, and small ceremonies are often performed in private or with minimal contact. Families maintain religious devotion while adhering to practical precautions. Windows are opened for ventilation, objects are blessed from a distance, and children participate in quiet observation rather than direct involvement. This blending of faith and public health creates continuity in routine and moral reassurance. Evening brings a heightened sense of vigilance. Streets are quieter, doors are secured, and families settle into rotation-based routines: cooking, cleaning, monitoring, and prayer. Children participate in observation and minor chores, internalizing both practical skills and adaptive behavior. The village functions as a network of controlled movement, observation, and subtle communication, where every action contributes to household and community endurance. By nightfall, the rhythm of curfews and quarantines shapes life profoundly. Families balance isolation with connection, vigilance with routine, and fear with practical measures. You feel that these adaptations, both mundane and inventive, form the scaffolding that allows households to survive under unprecedented circumstances. Each act of compliance, observation, or subtle communication becomes a brick in a fragile yet resilient structure of communal survival, quietly supporting life as the plague advances outside. By late morning, the intimate reality of the plague's reach becomes impossible to ignore. You trudge through the home, noting the hushed atmosphere as families confront illness directly. Coughs echo faintly from upstairs rooms, the scent of fevered bodies mingling with herbs and burning wood. Caregiving has become an all-consuming task, turning the sick, boiling water, washing bedding, and administering remedies. Every action carries risk, and even small missteps might have consequences. Historians still argue whether the close attention of family members meaningfully reduced mortality, or if it primarily served to provide comfort amid inevitable loss. Inside, you witness a household improvising care. Blankets are layered to contain illness, meals are prepared with extra caution, and one adult takes on the role of sole caregiver, limiting the number of contacts with the patient. Children, quiet but attentive, help in small ways, fetching water, wiping surfaces, or offering whispered encouragement. Fringe accounts suggest that some households employed strange measures, placing onions near the sick or hanging aromatic herbs in corners to draw out disease. Whether effective or purely symbolic, these actions reflect a desperate inventiveness grounded in observation, superstition, and necessity. Neighbors provide advice from a distance. You overhear muted conversations through windows. "Wrap the limbs to keep warmth," one whispers, while another suggests a concoction of boiled herbs. These exchanges are cautious and coded, balancing the urge to help with fear of contamination. You notice the subtle choreography of proximity and gesture, the careful calibration of trust and risk. Small acts of generosity, leaving a basket of bread or herbs, contrast with the instinct to avoid direct contact, illustrating the complex interplay of compassion and self-preservation. Funerary practices begin to surface as families grapple with death. You observe hurried preparations for burials, often conducted with minimal ceremony and strict hygiene, shovels cleaned, graves dug swiftly, and prayers whispered from a safe distance. Historians still debate whether these adaptations were pragmatic responses or extensions of ritual. Either way, they reveal a household negotiating the intimate and awkward realities of mortality. Fringe accounts describe families using sticks to maneuver the deceased, a method that seems almost comical now but underscores ingenuity under duress. Within households, emotional strain is palpable. You notice whispered conversations between adults, alternating between hope, fear, and grief. Children absorb tension while maintaining routines, learning that survival requires attentiveness, calm, and adaptability. Humor occasionally pierces the gloom. A dropped spoon or a misplaced herb prompts a brief, tense chuckle, easing stress without diminishing the gravity of the situation. These small interludes of normalcy serve as psychological lifelines, stabilizing morale when illness dominates every corner of life. Meals are no longer just nourishment, they are strategic acts of care. You watch food prepared with precision for the sick, portions measured, and herbs added with hope that they might ease suffering. Clean utensils and careful handling reinforce safety protocols, blending domestic discipline with ritualized attention. Families improvise, adapting recipes, boiling water longer than usual, or offering unfamiliar herbs. Each act reflects ingenuity, observation, and an instinct for survival refined under pressure. Children continue to play cautiously, mimicking adult behaviors in miniature. You observe them checking siblings' pulses, arranging herbs, or delivering messages, practices that teach observation, responsibility, and empathy. Even games carry survival lessons, preparing them emotionally and practically for a world transformed by disease. Historians still debate whether these early experiences shaped resilience in later life, but they clearly influence household dynamics and intergenerational knowledge transfer. By afternoon, caregiving routines dominate. Adults rotate duties, maintaining strict hygiene, monitoring symptoms, and documenting observations, sometimes with crude markings or notes. This systematic approach ensures that knowledge of the illness and responses is preserved within the household. Fringe accounts suggest that some families even used small sticks or ropes to maintain distance while still offering comfort, an improvisation that blends practicality and psychological care. Evening brings reflective quiet. You notice the exhaustion etched on every face, the careful attention to small tasks, and the moments of tender connection, a hand held briefly, a whispered word of reassurance, a child soothed with a familiar lullaby. The household functions as a microcosm of endurance, negotiating the presence of death while preserving life. Survival is rooted in attentiveness, adaptation, and the careful orchestration of care, however imperfectly. By nightfall, the household settles into fragile routines. Blankets are arranged, fires stoked, and the sick monitored one last time. The intimate, often awkward realities of caring for the dying have transformed the home into a space where life, death, and resilience coexist. You sense that the quiet acts of vigilance, improvisation, and empathy form the unseen architecture of survival, sustaining both body and spirit in the shadow of relentless threat. By late morning, the rituals surrounding death and grief emerge as unavoidable elements of daily life. You trudge through the home and notice the hushed, deliberate pace of preparation for funerals and burials. Families perform their tasks with a mix of fear, respect, and exhaustion. Shovels are scrubbed, graves dug swiftly, and prayers whispered over shrouded bodies. Even in moments of sorrow, practical considerations dominate. You notice adults taking precautions, washing hands repeatedly, limiting the number of participants, and keeping children at a safe distance. Historians still debate whether such adaptations reflected pragmatic measures or were extensions of spiritual ritual, but either way, they define how households confront mortality. Inside the home, grief is intertwined with ritual. Candles are lit, herbs burned, and prayers offered, sometimes quietly by a single person and sometimes as a small family group. Fringe accounts describe families chanting softly as they prepared the deceased for burial, convinced the sound would comfort the soul and deter disease. You notice that these acts, while symbolic, also structure the household's emotional response. They provide focus, reduce panic, and create a framework for navigating overwhelming loss. Children observe and participate in small ways. You see them arranging flowers or herbs near the hearth, imitating adult gestures of care, or repeating prayers they have learned. These actions teach them that death, while frightening, is managed through attention, ritual, and practical behavior. Even playful gestures, placing a small toy beside a shrouded body or drawing chalk outlines on the doorstep, allow children to process grief and maintain some sense of agency. Historians still argue whether early exposure to such loss had lasting psychological consequences or fostered resilience, but it undoubtedly shaped childhood experience. Neighbors' responses vary. Some families gather briefly for shared mourning, while others observe from a distance, sending prayers or gifts of food without approaching directly. Acts of communal grief are often tempered by caution, blending empathy with practical concern. You notice how these interactions reinforce social networks, providing support even under the constraints of fear and isolation. Fringe accounts suggest some households left small notes or charms at burial sites, a subtle method of communication and remembrance that also reflects creative adaptation to crisis. Even in the midst of sorrow, humor and routine persist. A misfired ritual or dropped candle might elicit a tense chuckle, releasing tension without diminishing reverence. Meals, chores, and caregiving continue alongside mourning, creating a delicate balance between attention to survival and respect for the departed. You notice how maintaining these routines reinforces household cohesion, allowing life to proceed even in the shadow of pervasive death. Practical considerations dominate funeral preparation. You observe families carefully wrapping bodies, using linens reserved for such purposes, and minimizing contact where possible. This attention to procedure reflects both caution and improvisation. Families combine superstition, observation, and inherited knowledge to navigate the logistics of death safely. Historians still debate how effective these practices were in controlling infection, yet they clearly demonstrate ingenuity under pressure. Emotional expression is both private and structured. You notice whispered conversations, shared tears, and brief comforting touches exchanged in carefully controlled spaces. Children learn to observe, imitate, and respond to grief with sensitivity, integrating lessons in empathy and social responsibility. The household functions as a microcosm of emotional management, balancing mourning with practical survival. Evening rituals bring the household together. Families light candles, offer prayers, and reflect on the day's losses. Children participate in ways appropriate to their understanding, reinforcing both spiritual and practical routines. Fringe accounts describe families singing soft, improvised songs to honor the dead, a combination of solace and psychological fortification. These rituals strengthen cohesion, providing structure and stability amid unpredictability. By nightfall, households carry the dual burden of mourning and maintenance. Meals are eaten quietly, fires tended, and the sick monitored with vigilance. Families confront grief through ritual, practical care, and emotional support, creating a fragile yet resilient framework that preserves life while acknowledging loss. You sense that these carefully orchestrated patterns, blending attention, ritual, and subtle acts of kindness, form the invisible architecture of endurance, sustaining households against the relentless shadow of the plague. By mid-morning, the household begins to notice the unsung heroes quietly shaping survival. You trudge through the home and see midwives tending to pregnant women with skill and care, even as fear lingers outside. Herbalists grind dried leaves and roots, concocting remedies whose efficacy historians still debate, yet their presence offers reassurance. You notice that these individuals, often overlooked in official records, carry knowledge accumulated over generations, blending observation, superstition, and practical experience to sustain life under impossible circumstances. Inside, the household relies on these helpers for both guidance and intervention. A midwife instructs the family on hygiene, positioning, and simple remedies, while herbalists provide instructions on brewing teas or preparing poultices. Fringe accounts suggest some employed unusual measures, such as hanging crushed flowers over doorways or sprinkling powdered minerals on windowsills. While these methods likely did little to impede infection, they instilled a sense of control and structure. You watch family members absorb these lessons, integrating them into daily routines and adapting practices to fit their immediate needs. Children observe these helpers closely. You notice them mimicking gestures, rolling herbs, carrying small water jugs, or whispering encouragement. Even play becomes an opportunity for learning. Healing games emerge, where children pretend to care for dolls or animals, imitating the midwives' and herbalists' precise movements. These exercises teach attentiveness, empathy, and manual skill, turning observation into practical knowledge that reinforces the household's resilience. Historians still debate how significantly these informal apprenticeships influenced long-term survival, but their role in shaping household capability is clear. Neighbors and itinerant helpers also contribute. You see travelers offering small quantities of herbs, advice on symptoms, or instructions for isolating the ill. Families negotiate cautiously, weighing trust against potential exposure. Acts of generosity are tempered by vigilance. A dropped bundle of roots may be disinfected in boiling water before use, a whispered warning followed by careful observation. These interactions reflect a delicate social calculus, where communal knowledge is shared sparingly but meaningfully, reinforcing networks of support without compromising safety. Within homes, daily routines incorporate these helpers' guidance. You observe a precise rotation of chores, preparing meals, cleaning shared spaces, monitoring health, and tending fires. Midwives and herbalists suggest minor modifications, such as boiling water longer, arranging sleeping areas differently, or administering small herbal doses at specific times. Fringe accounts mention some families relying on symbolic gestures, touching specific objects or reciting short chants, to enhance remedies. While efficacy is doubtful, the combination of guidance, ritual, and attentiveness strengthens morale and cohesion. Emotional labor is as crucial as practical labor. You notice helpers offering comfort alongside instruction, a soothing hand on a child's shoulder, quiet encouragement to a weary parent, or reassurance for the sick. These acts of care, subtle but profound, mitigate the psychological strain of constant vigilance. Families absorb these lessons, learning that endurance requires both technical knowledge and emotional resilience. Humor occasionally punctuates the day. A spilled herb jar or mispronounced chant elicits a brief, shared laugh, reinforcing bonds even amid fear. Markets, though sparse, reflect the influence of these unsung heroes. You notice families seeking advice on which herbs to purchase, observing the condition of supplies, and following improvised safety measures. Some itinerant helpers guide transactions, offering insights into storage, preparation, and administration. Historians still argue whether such practices materially reduced mortality, yet they illustrate the practical significance of knowledge networks in crisis. By afternoon, children and adults alike demonstrate adaptation shaped by these figures. Tasks once mundane, fetching water, preparing meals, cleaning surfaces, gain precision and significance. You observe the household functioning as a finely tuned system, each member aware of responsibilities, dangers, and contingencies. The guidance of midwives, herbalists, and itinerant helpers underpins this coordination, transforming uncertainty into manageable routines. Evening brings reflection and consolidation. Families gather around the hearth, reviewing lessons from the day, how remedies were applied, what chores were most effective, and which patterns of observation prevented missteps. Children recount small victories and mimic learned gestures, reinforcing knowledge through repetition. Fringe accounts describe whispered stories of helpers' exploits, teaching both caution and ingenuity. These narratives bind the household together, ensuring that practical wisdom and moral support persist through the night. By nightfall, you sense the invisible scaffolding these helpers provide. They blend observation, skill, and ritual, creating continuity, confidence, and competence within households. Even as the plague looms, families gain structure, knowledge, and subtle reassurance. You recognize that survival depends not solely on individual effort, but on the quiet, persistent guidance of those whose expertise straddles the line between practicality and tradition, forging lifelines in the shadow of catastrophe. By mid-morning, the village economy feels transformed under the shadow of the plague. You trudge past the marketplace, noticing how trade has contracted and priorities have shifted. Familiar stalls are less crowded, with vendors carefully arranging scarce goods to limit contact. You overhear conversations about bartering, a loaf of bread exchanged for a few eggs, dried herbs swapped for cheese. Families negotiate cautiously, weighing both necessity and exposure. Historians still debate whether these economic adaptations meaningfully influenced survival or simply redistributed scarcity, but the patterns are evident and pervasive. Inside your home, commerce blends with daily survival. You notice meticulous records of traded goods, quantities, dates, and the health status of trading partners. Even simple exchanges are deliberate. Fringe accounts describe households disinfecting coins in vinegar or boiling utensils used in barter, practices that may seem excessive but illustrate an intuitive understanding of contagion. Children are taught the rules of trade alongside chores, how to handle goods safely, record exchanges, and observe subtle cues in neighbors' behavior. These lessons reinforce both practical skill and social awareness. Food and supplies are now highly strategic. Families prioritize staples, rationing flour, dried meat, and grain, while fresh produce is carefully inspected and consumed quickly. You notice debates over preservation. Should fresh vegetables be eaten immediately or stored in cool cellars? Should grains be shared with neighbors or hoarded? Each choice carries moral and practical weight, shaping household survival strategies. Fringe accounts suggest that some households buried small caches of goods in secret locations, an inventive yet risky method of resource management. Trust and negotiation dominate interactions. You observe families balancing fear with mutual aid, leaving small bundles of food at a neighbor's doorstep, exchanging goods while maintaining distance, or sharing advice about safe trade practices. The economy is no longer abstract, it is intertwined with survival, social bonds, and vigilance. Historians still argue whether local economies mitigated mortality or primarily reflected social inequalities, but households clearly adapt to the constraints imposed by scarcity and contagion. Household routines reflect this new economic reality. Adults rotate tasks, preparing meals, tending fires, and managing supplies, while children assist by counting stock, fetching water, or observing neighbors' behaviors. Every action reinforces both survival and social cohesion. You notice a subtle shift. Economic activity is no longer purely transactional. It conveys trust, reinforces community ties, and sustains knowledge about resource management. Outside, you see small markets operating under strict precautions. Goods are displayed on benches, coins handled carefully, and interactions minimized. Some families leave notes indicating the condition of items or health status of traders. Fringe reports mention families creating small coded signals, knocks, marks, or gestures, to communicate availability or contamination risk. These improvisations reveal adaptive ingenuity, combining practical awareness with social coordination. Children continue learning through observation. You notice them accompanying adults on cautious errands, carrying baskets of goods, noting patterns of supply, and mimicking careful negotiation techniques. Even play reflects economic survival. Games involve trading tokens, simulating exchange, or practicing safe handling of precious goods. These small acts teach lessons that are practical, social, and psychological, embedding awareness of scarcity and trust. By afternoon, Households display intricate routines to maintain both physical and economic security. Meals are rationed with care, water sources monitored, and goods exchanged selectively. Families balance generosity and prudence, ensuring that each interaction serves both survival and social cohesion. You observe the subtle choreography, rotations of errands, careful handling of coins, and constant observation of neighbors' behavior. Historians still debate the long-term impacts of these adaptations, yet they clearly structured daily life. Evening reinforces these patterns. Families gather to review the day's trades, ration supplies, and observations. Children recount errands and successes, reinforcing lessons through storytelling and imitation. Fringe accounts describe families secretly practicing new preservation methods, sharing knowledge that is both practical and protective. The household becomes a hub of adaptive economic strategy, where vigilance, innovation, and social negotiation merge seamlessly with domestic life. By nightfall, you notice that commerce is no longer just about goods. It is about survival, trust, and the quiet, deliberate maintenance of household and community networks. Families have learned to navigate scarcity with ingenuity, balancing generosity and caution, and creating routines that support both physical sustenance and social cohesion. These patterns of exchange, practical, symbolic, and adaptive, become as vital to endurance as food itself, quietly sustaining life in the plague-stricken village. By mid-morning, the stench of the village has become an unavoidable backdrop to daily life. You trudge through streets where refuse, stagnant water, and the lingering odor of illness combine into a pervasive reminder of the plague's reach. Families innovate constantly to cope with the smells, blending practical hygiene with ritualized measures. You notice buckets of boiling water, herbs hung above doorways, and floors scrubbed repeatedly. Historians still argue whether these measures had a measurable impact on disease transmission or primarily served as psychological comfort, yet they shaped daily behavior profoundly. Inside your home, sanitation dominates routines. You watch adults scouring surfaces, boiling utensils, and washing linens in rotating batches. Children are enlisted to assist in minor cleaning tasks, learning early that diligence and attention to detail can be a form of protection. Fringe accounts suggest some households even sprinkled sand or ash over floors, believing it absorbed disease, while others hung bunches of aromatic plants to mask odors. While efficacy is questionable, these adaptations reinforce discipline and give a sense of agency amid uncertainty. Water management is critical. You notice families drawing from wells, filtering water through cloth, or boiling it for long periods. Containers are cleaned meticulously, and utensils are designated for specific members to prevent cross-contamination. These routines, repetitive and sometimes tedious, create a rhythm that structures the household's day. Fringe reports describe sprinkling vinegar or herbs into water as a protective measure, actions blending superstition with the observable effects of cleanliness. Odor management extends beyond practical hygiene. You see families burning small fires of aromatic wood, carrying bundles of herbs, and even keeping animals outside to reduce the mingling of scents. These measures combine sensory management with health-conscious thinking, turning everyday smells into cues for caution and protection. Children mimic these practices, carrying small herb bundles or lighting candles in supervised tasks, blending ritual with observation. Historians still debate whether these practices slowed infection or primarily eased psychological stress. Domestic rituals evolve around sanitation. You observe hand-washing ceremonies before meals, small blessings over clean floors, and symbolic gestures meant to ward off contamination. You notice that these gestures reinforce attention to detail, encourage consistency, and provide a framework for cooperative behavior. Fringe accounts suggest families developed elaborate routines of entering and leaving rooms, designed to minimize exposure and maintain a sense of order. These routines illustrate the blending of superstition, practicality, and psychology in daily life. Market visits are similarly regulated. Families avoid crowded spaces, disinfect coins, and handle goods with care. You see creative adaptations, produce displayed on cloths, goods passed across benches, and minimal verbal exchange to reduce risk. Acts of generosity, leaving small parcels for neighbors, coexist with strict boundaries. These behaviors reflect both practical survival instincts and subtle social negotiation, shaping trust and interaction under constraint. Children internalize hygiene as a form of empowerment. You observe them scrubbing floors, arranging herbs, and practicing hand-washing, often turning tasks into playful exercises. This engagement blends learning, discipline, and morale, reinforcing household survival strategies. Even small successes, clean floors, fragrant herbs, or disinfected utensils, become symbolic victories, embedding practical knowledge in everyday experience. By afternoon, sanitation has become the household's invisible backbone. Cooking, cleaning, and care routines intertwine seamlessly, creating protective habits that support health and cohesion. You notice the subtle choreography: who sweeps when, which surfaces are wiped first, and how tasks are rotated. Fringe reports describe families timing activities according to sun or airflow, believing these patterns influenced infection risk. Whether accurate or not, such attention sharpens observation and encourages careful planning. Evening rituals focus on maintaining both hygiene and calm. Families review chores, tend fires, and prepare bedding while discussing observations from the day. Children participate in tasks and quiet reflection, reinforcing routines and internalizing patterns of safety. The household functions as a microcosm of control amid chaos, where smell, cleanliness, and ritual converge to create a protective environment. By nightfall, you recognize how essential sanitation has become. Homes have transformed into carefully managed spaces where attention to odor, hygiene, and ritual safeguards both health and morale. Families navigate daily life through observation, innovation, and subtle superstition, creating structures that preserve survival and reinforce cohesion. Even something as ordinary as cleaning has evolved into a strategic, psychological, and symbolic act of endurance, quietly sustaining households in the shadow of the plague. By mid-morning, communication beyond the household becomes increasingly vital. You trudge to the edge of your yard and notice neighbors signaling with gestures, notes, or small parcels, transmitting information without direct contact. Letters, though rare and precious, travel carefully from one household to another, carrying news of illness, remedies, or supply availability. Historians still debate the effectiveness of such communication networks in mitigating mortality, but their social and psychological importance is unmistakable. They shape expectations, reduce uncertainty, and foster cautious connection. Inside your home, letters are handled with deliberate care. You watch as the family washes hands before and after reading, places messages near smoke or sunlight, or isolates paper for a day to ensure safety. Fringe accounts describe families even using vinegar or herbal sprays to cleanse documents, blending superstition with observed hygiene practices. Children observe these routines closely, learning that attention to detail in communication can be as critical as in caregiving or food management. Messages vary in content and tone. Some carry practical advice: which herbs have worked, how long to boil water, or where to find clean grain. Others convey warnings or rumors: which households show signs of illness, which travelers pass through, and subtle assessments of risk. Even seemingly mundane notes carry weight, shaping daily routines, movement, and interactions. You notice that these written networks supplement oral observation, extending awareness across the village. Visitors are rare and carefully controlled. You observe families negotiating drop-off points, exchanging parcels with minimal contact, and observing signals to indicate health or contamination risk. These protocols are improvisational yet disciplined, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of risk management in an era without formal epidemiology. Fringe accounts suggest that some households even devised coded symbols or color markings to indicate the severity of illness, creating a primitive but effective early warning system. Children learn the art of cautious communication. You see them delivering messages between rooms or to neighboring households, practicing discretion, hygiene, and observation simultaneously. These tasks teach responsibility, attention, and social awareness, while reinforcing household routines and survival strategies. Even play is adapted. Children simulate message delivery, imitating adults and learning subtleties of trust and risk management. Within homes, knowledge is preserved meticulously. You notice adults recording observations, noting patterns of symptoms, and comparing them with received messages. These records, however rudimentary, create continuity and memory, allowing households to respond adaptively to evolving circumstances. Historians still debate how much this informal knowledge-sharing influenced long-term outcomes, but its role in shaping immediate behavior is clear. Emotional support travels alongside information. Notes often include comforting words or encouragement, reinforcing morale amid isolation. You observe how such gestures, though small, stabilize emotional and social networks, reminding families that connection persists even when proximity is risky. Fringe accounts describe families leaving small charms or tokens with letters, blending practical advice with symbolic reassurance. By afternoon, communication has become a structured rhythm. Messages are delivered, received, and acted upon with care, shaping decisions about isolation, resources, and daily routines. Families track not only goods and symptoms but also emotional and social signals, creating a network of observation and response that extends well beyond the household. Evening emphasizes review and reflection. Adults and children gather to discuss received notes, lessons from errands, and adjustments to household routines. You notice subtle strategies emerging, prioritizing urgent messages, confirming details, and integrating new knowledge into daily tasks. These exchanges strengthen cohesion, coordination, and vigilance. By nightfall, you sense that communication, through letters, parcels, or discreet signals, forms an invisible thread linking households. It extends awareness, reinforces trust, and enables adaptive responses, blending practical, social, and psychological functions. Even in the shadow of uncertainty and isolation, these quiet exchanges maintain connection, information flow, and a delicate structure of resilience across the village, subtly sustaining life and survival. By mid-morning, love and family bonds adapt under the relentless pressure of the plague. You trudge through the home, noticing how routines and relationships subtly shift to accommodate risk and survival. Courting couples, once free to wander and flirt, now navigate intimacy with caution, sometimes communicating through letters or gestures across yards. Arranged marriages continue, but decisions are weighed with heightened awareness of vulnerability and mortality. Historians still debate how these shifts affected population structure or long-term family patterns, but the immediate impact on daily life is profound. Inside households, affection manifests in small, deliberate acts. You watch a parent soothe a child with extra care, a spouse assist another in chores while avoiding close contact, and a hand briefly held over a meal as reassurance. Fringe accounts describe families placing symbolic objects, flowers, charms, or shared trinkets, to signify attachment and care, a subtle but potent reinforcement of bonds. Even simple gestures, a shared loaf, a whispered joke, carry amplified significance in a world where proximity carries risk. Children learn about love and connection through observation. You notice them mimicking affectionate gestures while maintaining safe distance, passing small gifts, folding notes, or carrying symbolic tokens between family members. Play evolves to include cooperation and empathy, blending entertainment with the cultivation of emotional resilience. Through these interactions, children internalize the importance of connection, trust, and attentiveness, even under constraint. Household rituals reflect the blending of intimacy and caution. Meals, prayers, and chores are performed collectively yet carefully, ensuring contact is minimized while relationships are maintained. You observe couples exchanging brief touches or gestures across spaces, communicating reassurance without compromising safety. Fringe reports suggest some families used coded touches or shared symbols as private signs of affection, creatively navigating fear and attachment simultaneously. Marriage and partnership dynamics are reshaped. You see couples discussing risk, dividing tasks, and negotiating proximity in ways they never anticipated. Decisions about childcare, caregiving, and resource allocation are increasingly collaborative, highlighting the interplay between practical survival and relational negotiation. Historians still debate whether these adjustments led to more egalitarian household structures or merely reinforced survival-focused hierarchies, but the immediate effect on daily life is evident. Neighbors' interactions are equally constrained but meaningful. You notice subtle acts of connection, a nod exchanged across the street, a basket of food delivered with care, or discreet messages expressing concern. These gestures maintain social and emotional cohesion without compromising safety. Even small acts of solidarity, sharing news about family health or survival strategies, strengthen bonds across households, blending practical assistance with emotional support. Children internalize lessons in relational awareness. You see them mediating minor disputes, delivering notes, or observing family interactions, gradually learning the subtleties of trust, empathy, and social negotiation. Playful imitations of adult interactions serve as rehearsal for future cooperation and communication, reinforcing resilience both practically and emotionally. By afternoon, household life is a carefully orchestrated balance of intimacy, vigilance, and care. Daily routines, meals, chores, communication, and monitoring are interwoven with acts of affection, ritual, and subtle reinforcement of trust. Even under the constant threat of illness, these small, deliberate gestures sustain relationships and maintain morale. Evening underscores the importance of emotional endurance. Families gather quietly, sharing meals, exchanging brief touches, and offering words of reassurance. Children participate in rituals of care and empathy, reinforcing household cohesion and modeling adaptive behavior. Fringe accounts describe couples leaving small symbolic objects for one another, embedding emotional connection within practical survival strategies. By nightfall, you notice that family bonds, expressed through affection, cooperation, and subtle ritual, have become essential tools for navigating uncertainty. Love and connection are carefully balanced with caution, blending psychological support, practical cooperation, and ritualized gestures into a resilient network that sustains households emotionally and physically. These intimate acts, small but profound, shape daily life and bolster the quiet endurance that allows families to persist amid crisis. By mid-morning, the role of animals in daily life becomes strikingly apparent. You trudge through the yard, noticing chickens scratching near the kitchen, cats weaving silently around the hearth, and goats tethered carefully to prevent wandering. Pets and livestock serve multiple purposes: sustenance, companionship, and sometimes unexpected indicators of environmental change or disease. Historians still argue how much animals contributed to the spread of plague, whether through fleas or proximity, but households respond by balancing care, superstition, and practicality. Inside, the management of animals becomes part of the household routine. You notice children tasked with feeding poultry, adults milking goats, and cats chasing pests from pantries. Fringe accounts describe households observing animal behavior for omens. A cat avoiding a corner might indicate danger. A rooster crowing unusually often could signal illness. These interpretations may seem whimsical now, yet they reflect an intuitive attempt to read environmental cues and mitigate risk. Animals also provide psychological support. You watch children stroking cats, talking softly to dogs, and relying on the steady presence of livestock for comfort amid uncertainty. Even routine tasks, feeding, cleaning, herding, offer structure and a sense of agency. Families increasingly integrate these responsibilities into daily schedules, blending practicality with emotional reassurance. Household strategies adapt to minimize risk from animals. Chickens are kept separate from sick rooms, cats are prevented from wandering through contaminated areas, and livestock are sometimes tethered or confined to reduce exposure. You notice careful monitoring, observing for unusual behavior, isolating animals showing signs of distress, and consulting neighbors or herbalists for advice. Fringe reports suggest some households used herbs or smoke to protect animals, blending superstition with an early sense of veterinary hygiene. Children learn to observe and interpret animal behavior. You notice them noting which chickens avoid certain areas, which cats follow them silently, or which goats appear lethargic. Play transforms into exercises in observation and responsibility. Checking the animals becomes both a game and a practical lesson in monitoring for signs of illness. These experiences foster attentiveness, empathy, and problem-solving skills, reinforcing broader survival strategies. Animals also influence household economy and nutrition. You see families carefully rationing milk, eggs, or meat, balancing immediate sustenance with long-term survival. Livestock can be bartered or shared cautiously with neighbors, creating subtle economic and social networks. Historians still debate whether households that relied on animals fared better during the plague, but their strategic value is evident. Outside, interactions with neighbors often involve animals. You observe the careful exchange of livestock or advice about their care, combined with hygiene measures to prevent contamination. Fringe accounts describe families leaving small gifts or charms near animals to protect both pets and humans, blending practical and symbolic precaution. These acts strengthen bonds while preserving essential resources. By afternoon, animals are deeply integrated into daily routines. Feeding, cleaning, monitoring, and observing become coordinated tasks shared among adults and children. The presence of animals structures household activity, provides cues for vigilance, and offers emotional sustenance. Even small successes, a well-fed goat, a healthy chicken, a calm cat, are quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and routine. Evening routines reflect the household's adaptation to animal care. You notice children performing small tasks under supervision, adults coordinating feed and monitoring areas, and pets nestled safely away from sick rooms. The blending of practicality, observation, and ritual demonstrates the household's ingenuity in sustaining both human and animal life. By nightfall, you recognize that animals are more than companions or food sources, they are integral to the household's survival strategy. Observing, caring for, and interpreting the behavior of livestock and pets enhances vigilance, reinforces routines, and provides emotional stability. In the shadow of the plague, these quiet, everyday interactions become crucial threads in the intricate fabric of resilience, sustaining both practical needs and human connection. By mid-morning, the household shifts focus towards stories, songs, and whispered legends. You trudge past the hearth and notice adults and children gathering in small circles, sharing tales that blend observation, superstition, and imagination. Stories of distant illness, miraculous recoveries, and heroic neighbors circulate quietly, serving both entertainment and instruction. Historians still debate the degree to which oral tradition preserved practical survival knowledge versus purely cultural memory, but its role in maintaining morale and cohesion is undeniable. Inside, storytelling becomes structured yet flexible. You notice parents weaving lessons into narratives, how a neighbor's careful isolation prevented contagion, or how a clever use of herbs relieved symptoms. Fringe accounts suggest some households incorporated symbolic or even fantastical elements, such as talking animals or protective spirits, to make stories memorable and reinforce behavioral rules. Children absorb both content and form, learning to recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, and understand the consequences of actions. Songs serve a similar function. You hear simple refrains that encode information about hygiene, herbal remedies, or cautionary behavior. Even playful jingles carry survival lessons. Washing hands before meals, avoiding contact with the ill, or observing unusual behavior in neighbors or animals. Children participate enthusiastically, singing along and inventing variations, embedding practical knowledge through repetition and rhythm. Historians still argue whether such mnemonic devices materially influenced household outcomes, but the psychological and social effects are clear. Outside, information spreads through whispered legends. You notice neighbors exchanging stories of mysterious cures, or sharing accounts of bravery and ingenuity. Even fragmentary tales serve as informal guidance, reinforcing social norms and encouraging adaptive behavior. Fringe reports describe families attributing minor successes, like avoiding infection, to clever ritual or observation, blending fact and fiction in ways that strengthen community cohesion. Within homes, storytelling intersects with ritual and daily work. Children listen while performing chores, adults discuss events during meal preparation, and the repetition of familiar narratives establishes a comforting rhythm. You notice that stories create a shared framework, transmitting knowledge, reinforcing rules, and soothing anxiety simultaneously. Even humor appears subtly. A misheard tale or exaggerated event elicits quiet laughter, releasing tension without diminishing the seriousness of survival. Children's imagination is also harnessed. You see them inventing mini-plays or puppet performances that reenact lessons from adult stories, reinforcing vigilance, empathy, and practical skills. Play becomes educational, a safe space to rehearse responses to illness, isolation, and social negotiation. These exercises integrate observation, memory, and creativity into survival strategy. Neighborhood interactions continue to blend narrative and observation. Families share experiences through coded signals, notes, or brief exchanges, transmitting lessons embedded in story form. You notice that these exchanges serve multiple purposes: conveying practical knowledge, reinforcing social norms, and maintaining morale. Fringe accounts suggest that some households created informal story circles at safe distances, blending communal entertainment with survival instruction. By afternoon, storytelling and song structure the household's emotional and cognitive life. You observe routines punctuated by narrative pauses, songs reinforcing hygiene or caution, and children integrating lessons into daily chores. These practices create continuity, offering both entertainment and instruction while stabilizing mood and focus. Evening consolidates this culture of narrative. Families gather near the hearth, recounting the day's events, improvising tales, and singing softly. Children practice gestures learned from stories, reinforcing vigilance and observation. The combination of ritual, narrative, and repetition strengthens household cohesion, transmitting knowledge and moral guidance while providing comfort in an unpredictable world. By nightfall, you recognize the subtle power of stories, songs, and legends. They preserve practical knowledge, teach observation and caution, and reinforce social and emotional bonds. Even in the shadow of fear and isolation, these creative practices sustain resilience, offering a quiet rhythm that intertwines daily life with memory, guidance, and human connection, quietly reinforcing the household's capacity to endure. By mid-morning, the first signs of recovery ripple through the village. You trudge along familiar streets, noticing cautiously reopened markets, tentative gatherings, and the slow return of movement. Families who endured the early waves of illness begin emerging from isolation, carrying lessons etched deeply into daily routines. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of recovery, but its effects are evident. Households reorganize, neighbors reconnect, and a sense of fragile normalcy begins to settle. Inside your home, routines subtly shift. You watch adults balancing care for the recovering with continued vigilance, monitoring lingering symptoms, maintaining hygiene, and slowly reintegrating social activities. Children resume more active play, though with awareness and observation ingrained from months of survival. Fringe accounts suggest that some families performed small ceremonies to mark recovery, blending gratitude, superstition, and practical reflection. These acts reinforce continuity, signaling both emotional closure and the consolidation of hard-earned survival skills. Neighborly interaction also adapts. You notice cautious greetings, parcels exchanged with careful notes, and the resumption of barter under newly understood protocols. Acts of generosity and trust flourish, yet tempered by experience and awareness of lingering risk. You observe families subtly negotiating social contracts, who may enter homes, how goods are handled, and which interactions require heightened attention. Historians still debate whether these adaptive social patterns significantly influenced long-term resilience, but their immediate function is clear. They stabilize relationships while minimizing renewed risk. Economic life cautiously revives. Markets buzz lightly, goods are exchanged with hygiene in mind, and families apply knowledge gained from scarcity. You notice innovations carried forward, careful storage of supplies, attention to spoilage, and inventive methods of limiting exposure during transactions. Fringe reports mention households continuing symbolic protective measures alongside practical ones, blending old habits with new routines. These behaviors reflect a cautious optimism. Life is returning, but the lessons of survival remain central. Household routines reflect a blend of resilience and adaptation. Adults rotate chores to manage energy, monitor hygiene, and integrate recovered members into daily work. Children resume tasks with confidence, applying skills learned during the crisis. Observation, empathy, and attention to detail, once critical for survival, now inform everyday life, ensuring continuity of knowledge across generations. You notice a subtle pride in competence. Small victories are quietly celebrated as families regain agency over their environment. Stories and songs evolve to mark recovery. You hear recounting of near misses, clever adaptations, and heroic acts, blending practical guidance with communal memory. Children contribute with imaginative retellings, dramatizations, or songs, reinforcing lessons learned and embedding them within cultural memory. Fringe accounts describe households creating new legends of endurance, celebrating both survival and ingenuity, a quiet testament to human adaptability. Faith and ritual continue to structure household life. You notice prayers of thanks, symbolic gestures marking the end of isolation, and cautious reintegration of community rituals. These practices reinforce cohesion, stabilize emotion, and maintain continuity with tradition, blending spiritual reassurance with practical observation. Historians still argue whether ritual influenced recovery, but it clearly reinforces social and emotional stability. By afternoon, households are reorganized and routines optimized. Meals are prepared efficiently, cleaning remains rigorous, and observation continues, albeit with less intensity. You notice that families integrate lessons from prior months. Isolation protocols, hygiene habits, communication networks, and social negotiation are now part of standard practice, quietly fortifying resilience against potential setbacks. Evening emphasizes reflection and reinforcement. Families gather, recounting experiences, sharing insights, and noting successful adaptations. Children participate actively, demonstrating skills learned in observation, caregiving, and cautious interaction. These practices consolidate knowledge, transform experience into habit, and strengthen bonds, ensuring that lessons persist beyond immediate crisis. By nightfall, you sense the delicate balance of recovery. Households emerging from isolation, neighborhoods cautiously reconnecting, and social life cautiously resuming. Survival has left its imprint on routines, relationships, and knowledge systems. Families carry forward both practical skills and emotional resilience, navigating the transition from crisis to cautious continuity. Historians still debate the timeline and impact of resurgence, yet the adaptive strategies, rituals, and bonds forged in the shadow of plague endure, quietly shaping the village's path forward. By mid-morning, the village hums with cautious energy. You trudge past streets that once felt empty and silent, now dotted with children playing under watchful eyes, neighbors exchanging goods with care, and families emerging from isolation. The rhythm of daily life is slower, more deliberate, and shaped by the memory of hardship. Households have adapted, carrying forward practices learned during the plague. Careful observation, structured chores, meticulous hygiene, and measured social interaction. Historians still argue about how long these changes persisted or whether they influenced broader societal structures, but their impact on household life is unmistakable. Inside your home, routines blend continuity with adaptation. You watch adults manage meals with attention, children perform tasks with precision, and all family members maintain habits honed over months of vigilance. Even small gestures, cleaning counters, boiling water, arranging herbs, carry lessons embedded from past experience. Fringe accounts describe families marking recovered rooms with symbols of gratitude or protection, subtle acts of reassurance that blend practicality with ritual. These practices reinforce cohesion and morale, bridging the gap between fear and confidence. Neighborly interaction continues cautiously. Families greet one another with nods or small parcels, applying lessons from months of careful observation. Acts of generosity, previously tempered by fear, now carry optimism and renewed trust. You notice families negotiating exchanges of food, goods, or advice with an awareness of risk and a sense of shared experience. These interactions maintain social networks while embedding practical knowledge in communal memory. Children, having internalized survival lessons, navigate the village with attentiveness and creativity. You observe them delivering small items, monitoring animals, and participating in chores, integrating observation, empathy, and practical skill. Play often simulates real-world challenges, reinforcing patterns of vigilance, resourcefulness, and cooperation. Historians still debate whether such experiences produced lasting resilience, but the adaptive behavior is clear in their daily activities. Within households, emotional resilience is quietly evident. Families maintain routines, share quiet humor, and engage in reflection. Stories and songs recount lessons from months of survival, embedding guidance in memory and culture. You notice that these narratives now include triumphs and small victories, reinforcing morale while transmitting practical knowledge. Fringe accounts describe children inventing new variations on tales or songs, demonstrating how creativity and learning intertwine with endurance. Economic life cautiously revives. You see markets resuming, with families applying prior strategies, careful handling of goods, hygiene protocols, and prudent negotiation. Some households innovate methods of storage or trade to maintain safety and continuity. Even symbolic gestures, notes, tokens, or coded signals persist, blending practical strategy with social communication. Historians still debate the long-term effects of these adaptations on economic resilience, yet the immediate benefits are evident. Faith and ritual continue to structure daily life. Families blend gratitude, reflection, and caution, marking recovery and reinforcing cohesion. Prayers, small ceremonies, and symbolic gestures provide psychological support while maintaining continuity with tradition. You notice that these rituals help integrate the lessons of survival into ongoing household life, blending spiritual, emotional, and practical dimensions. By afternoon, households operate with a careful efficiency. Tasks, preparing meals, monitoring health, cleaning, and communication, are performed with expertise developed during the plague. Children participate actively, applying observation, coordination, and vigilance. Even leisure is integrated into routines, with storytelling, music, and play reinforcing knowledge, cohesion, and morale. Evening brings a quiet reflection. Families gather around hearths, reviewing lessons learned, acknowledging losses, and celebrating survival. Children mimic adult routines, embedding adaptive behavior in both practical and imaginative ways. Neighborhood exchanges of news, advice, and small gifts continue, creating a supportive network that balances caution with community. By nightfall, you sense the subtle yet profound legacy of survival. Households carry forward knowledge, routines, and rituals honed under the shadow of plague. Families have adapted, integrating observation, empathy, ritual, and practical skill into a resilient framework. Social networks, economic adaptations, and emotional endurance reinforce one another, sustaining life and cohesion. Historians still debate which strategies were most critical, but the lived experience of households reveals a complex tapestry of innovation, vigilance, and quiet resilience, shaping the village's path beyond crisis. As night deepens, the village exhales a gentle, weary sigh. You sit by the hearth, the flickering fire casting soft shadows across familiar walls, and allow yourself to notice the quiet pulse of survival. The chaos and fear of earlier days have left their mark, yet in their wake, families have cultivated rhythms that sustain both body and mind. Meals prepared with care, herbs arranged with intention, and children guided through chores all testify to human adaptability. Even the smallest gestures, tidying a floor, adjusting a blanket, or offering a whispered word of reassurance, resonate with significance, forming threads that hold the household together against the unseen and unpredictable. Outside, the streets are calmer, yet the memory of absence lingers. The village, scarred but enduring, moves with cautious deliberation. You imagine neighbors exchanging quiet nods, parcels left at thresholds, and children playing with newfound awareness of the world's fragility. These ordinary acts are imbued with extraordinary meaning. vigilance, empathy, and ingenuity interwoven with everyday routines. Even stories told softly by candlelight serve as vessels for lessons, laughter, and comfort, bridging generations and reinforcing communal memory. The lessons of the plague extend beyond survival. You sense that households have acquired a subtle knowledge of observation, precaution, and coordination. Each room, every object, and every routine reflects accumulated wisdom, a map of what works and what falters under stress. Caregiving, domestic hygiene, economic negotiation, and emotional support have all been elevated from mundane tasks to acts of endurance. Children, growing up amid this careful orchestration, internalize responsibility, empathy, and resilience, carrying these qualities forward long after the crisis subsides. As the fire dwindles, a profound stillness settles over the village. You notice the gentle cadence of breathing, the soft rustle of blankets, and the quiet stirrings of life preserved through attentiveness and care. The lessons of adaptation, ritual, observation, and subtle heroism linger in the air, a comforting testament to the human capacity for endurance. Even in darkness, hope persists, threaded delicately through everyday acts, whispered stories, and the careful maintenance of bonds that ensure life continues, quietly and steadily.